I am Professor Hui-Rak Park, former Dean of the Graduate School of Politics and Leadership at Kookmin University, Seoul, South Korea. I have conducted research on North Korea's nuclear issue for many years and have recently published 14 English-language journal articles as well as 2 books in English. Through this channel, I will explain critical security issues using AI-based voice and images.
Hi everyone. Today I'm going to cover a very sensitive yet important topic. It's the comparison of military power between North and South Korea, including nuclear weapons. Up until now, nuclear weapons haven't really been included in military power comparisons. That's likely because they are so lethal, or perhaps because we simply don't want to imagine them ever being used. But in a reality where North Korea possesses nukes, does it even make sense to discuss military power without them? Actually, nuclear weapons have been used before, back in 1945. At that time, 16 kilotons was dropped on Hiroshima and 20 kilotons on Nagasaki, resulting in the loss of roughly 200,000 lives. Modern nuclear weapons are dozens or even hundreds of times more powerful than they were back then. Interestingly, during the Cold War, Russia drafted war plans that included the use of nuclear weapons, arguing that their use wouldn't necessarily mean the end of humanity, and North Korea might have been influenced by this. Even in the recent war in Ukraine, Russia has frequently threatened to use nuclear weapons. Specifically, with North Korea securing nuclear weapons, while the two sides were previously facing off with only conventional forces, the military balance between the two nations must have shifted significantly. Therefore, it's just not realistic to exclude nukes and claim the South has the military upper hand. The problem is figuring out how to evaluate nuclear weapons and incorporate them into military power. I've calculated it by viewing nuclear weapons as something that creates a multiplier effect, boosting the power of conventional weapons. In other words, a non-nuclear defending nation can't counterattack boldly out of fear of nukes, must disperse its units, and suffers a sharp drop in combat efficiency due to heavy protective gear. Meanwhile, a nuclear-armed aggressor can push forward much more aggressively with the if all else fails, we'll use nukes kind of guts. So even if they aren't used, just possessing them increases the effectiveness of existing combat power. I've divided this multiplier effect into 5 levels based on nuclear strategy. A nuclear deterrent strategy, like that of the US and Russia, which aims to cause the maximum possible damage to the opponent, is seen as maximum deterrence and given a 100% multiplier effect. Strategies like those of the UK or France, which can attack and destroy only specific targets the opponent values, are minimum deterrence, which I've evaluated to have about 50. Cases that fall between maximum and minimum, like China, are classified as limited deterrence. Additionally, levels that don't reach minimum deterrence are called credible minimum deterrence, and simply possessing nuclear weapons is referred to as existential deterrence. The multiplier effect percentages I've assigned to each strategy type are shown in the table. An additional factor to consider is the case of non-nuclear countries that receive extended deterrence, or a nuclear umbrella, from a nuclear-armed ally. Just as the U.S. nuclear umbrella promise is evaluated as deterring a North Korea nuclear attack, this promise must also be seen as producing a certain multiplier effect. Therefore, I calculated the U.S. nuclear umbrella promise by assigning it 20%, the maximum value for existential deterrence. Because I've treated nuclear weapons as a multiplier effect, we have to evaluate conventional power first to compare military strength, including nukes. To do this, I gave a 50% weight to defense spending as an input, and for the remaining 50%, I considered 9 key types of equipment as outputs. 1. Active duty soldiers. 2. Reserves. 3. Tanks. 4. Artillery. 5. Warships. 6. Submarines. 7. Fighter jets. 8. Air defense missiles. And 9. Attack missiles. The issue here is the lack of data on North Korea's defense spending. However, because the North Korean military is self-sufficient through its own business activities, and labor costs make up a very small portion, it's hard to judge based on nominal figures alone. In 2013, the head of South Korea's Defense Intelligence Agency testified to the National Assembly that North Korea's defense spending should be viewed as about 1/3 of the South's. Therefore, I calculated North Korea's defense spending at the 1/3 level of South Korea's. I published a paper using this method in 2018. Now, let me explain the details of the North-South military comparison, including nuclear weapons. For the major equipment, I applied data from Military Balance 2025, published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in the UK, which is the most authoritative source on global military status. The resulting North-South military comparison is shown in the table. Looking at the results, in terms of conventional power, South and North Korea score 900 to 776, which is 100 to 86 in percentage terms, meaning the South is evaluated as slightly superior. However, in a short-term war, the major weapons and equipment already on hand are what matter most, so if we only consider the output based on major weapons and equipment, the score is 900 to 1252, or 100 to 139 in percentage terms, giving the North a slight lead. Now it's time to include the nuclear weapons. I evaluated North Korea's nuclear strength as being at the minimum deterrence level and assigned a 50% multiplier. For South Korea, since it doesn't possess its own nukes, but has the U.S. extended deterrence promise, I assigned a 20% multiplier, the maximum for existential deterrence. Once you do that, the military power index for South and North Korea becomes 1,080 to 1,164, or 100 to 108 in percentage terms, meaning North Korea's military power is evaluated as slightly superior to the South's. However, if the U.S. extended deterrence were not provided, the military balance between the South and North would be 900 to 1,164, or 100 to 129, meaning the North would be about 30% stronger. Furthermore, in the case of a short-term decisive war that only considers the output side of military power, this gap widens even further. The balance becomes 1,080 to 1,878, or 100 to 170, showing that the North possesses a military that is 70% stronger than the South's. In conclusion, even if we just look at the multiplier effect that comes from the mere existence of nuclear weapons, without them actually being fired, the analysis shows North Korea's military is 30% to as much as 70%. If you found today's content helpful, please like and subscribe.